Welcome, listeners. You are listening to a podcast from the Free People's Movement out of Sweden. We've touched up the narration and audio of this episode since our initial release of this series, with hopes to make the listening experience even more immersive. Hopefully, we can re-release at least parts of the series on this platform, since the censorship on YouTube has been quite extensive, both in terms of shadow banning and outright deletion of our content. We thought we would start with episode 13, The Lord of the Rings and the All-Seeing Eye. Like we've said before, the deep state is a very old entity, but has taken a few different forms over the years. What was once called colonialism now exists in the form of globalism. Remember, controlling money buys control of government. Control of information, money and government buys control of the people. Seeing as the entity we call the deep state has been around for such a long time, there surely must have been people over the years who knew about this hidden structure and have tried to counteract it. Yes, but if they were too vocal about it, more often than not, they would either end up silenced or murdered. Actually, there is no shortage of people that have tried to counteract the deep state over the years, but let's just say they were not always successful. At least, not until now. We will in this episode have a look at one certain individual that without question knew a lot about the deep state and did his best to expose what he could manage. John Ronald Royal Tolkien, born the 3rd of January 1892 in Bloemfontein in present-day South Africa, and died on the 2nd of September 1973 in Bournemouth, Dorset, United Kingdom. Tolkien was a British author, philologist and university professor, and best known as the author of the fantasy novels called The Lord of the Rings. Already as a child, he showed a fantastic language ability, and as a young student, he was fascinated by the Kalevala epic. Kalevala is a Finnish and Karelian national epic. It is a heroic poem in 50 songs, which is characterized by alliterations and a special rhythm. Based on that, Tolkien created all the fairy tales, languages and worlds that today can be seen as one of the cornerstones of the fantasy genre. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon in Oxford and also fluent in Nordic languages and could read and write in, among other languages, Swedish. It was also the Nordic languages that formed the basis of his own languages, which he incorporated into The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was also friends with another master, C.S. Lewis, whose books on Narnia have captivated generations of children. Tolkien studied English and English literature at the University of Oxford, majoring in philology. Tolkien served as a signal officer in the British Army during the First World War and took part in the Battle of the Somme. He contracted trench fever in late 1916 and spent the rest of the war in England. Meanwhile, on the home front, he began work on his legend, the book Silmarillion, which would not appear in print until 4 years after his death, in 1977. As he had served as a signal officer in the First World War, by the time the Second World War came around, Tolkien was earmarked as a code breaker. In January 1939, he was handpicked to serve in the cryptographic department of the Foreign Office, in the event of national emergency. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Government Code and Cipher School, which became known as the GCHQ in April 1946, ran courses for hand-picked individuals from universities who might join the organization in the event of war. As seen on this list from the GCHQ, Tolkien would take part in the Scandinavian and Spanish areas of study. He's even written down as keen, meaning he was eager to take part in the studies. By late October 1939, Tolkien was informed that his services would no longer be required. In short, they didn't want him anywhere near signal intelligence. We could speculate quite extensively on the reason the GCHQ decided to end Tolkien's engagement as a code breaker. But as we will try to show in this episode, it was probably because he was a bit too clever for his own good. What if we told you that Tolkien probably had his suspicions that something didn't quite add up? Remember, he had served in the First World War as a signal officer, but now the GCHQ didn't want his services. We are willing to bet that Tolkien might have been a little too open about his suspicions. It's very hard to find anything today that relates to Tolkien's dismissal from the GCHQ. The official statement from the GCHQ completely contradicts what Tolkien himself has written on the subject. The official statement reads as follows: although he has a Keen written after his name, possibly indicating he was willing to undertake such work, in the end he did not join us. Alternatively, Keen could simply be a note on how to pronounce Tolkien. We'll probably never know which meaning was intended. Well, either Tolkien was considered a liability due to his insights about the world, or he simply decided not to take part in the charade. It doesn't really matter, as both alternatives are probable. So, how can we be sure that Tolkien actually, so to speak, knew too much? Let's just say that he tells us through the Lord of the Rings novels. Tolkien actually exposes several parts of what we now call the deep state, although he shrouded them in metaphors and similes. The name The Lord of the Rings is actually a play on words, pointing to the governor of the Bank of England, a man called Montague Collet Norman. A collet is an object that forms a collar around an object that exerts a strong clamping force when it is tightened. In short, a ring that exerts pressure around one's neck. The rings in the novel symbolize the central banks in each country, exerting pressure around the neck of the population through debt. The Bank of England is the central bank of the United Kingdom. The Lord of the Rings metaphorically describes the banking system, with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, with the national central banks as intermediaries and the regional private banks as the ultimate executive unit to control the population. Rings, within a ring. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. The monetary system is a system of control. There are more systems of rings outside the purely monetary rings of control. For example, like the system of rings that colonial empire creators such as Cecil Rhodes called Round Table Conferences, and as described by Professor Carol Quigley in the book Tragedy and Hope, we know some of these rings as the Bilderberg Group, the G20, World Economic Forum, the Trilateral Commission, and the Foreign Policy Institutes. They rule through bureaucracy. This is masterfully thought out by Tolkien, who, in addition to writing fairy tales and being a professor of Old Norse languages at Oxford, was also a committed debater on the financial systems and their contemporary course and origins. So, we've established that the rings symbolize the banks. Well, what about Sauron's all-seeing eye that sits on top of Mountain Barad-dûr? Well, who surveils everything? Who sees all? This is, of course, also a metaphor. Let us introduce the telephone tower in Stockholm. The telephone tower was completed in 1887 and was a 50-meter high truss tower on Malmskillnadsgatan that collected 4,000 telephone wires in Stockholm. In the building below, switchboard operators sat and connected the calls. Of course, it would probably never have occurred to them to have telephone surveillance activities in the same building. The telephone tower had been commissioned by Stockholm's Public Telephone AB, a company that would later merge with Ericsson. Go back and listen to episode 2 where we explain more about the company called Ericsson. Pretty soon the public and the press thought that the tower was ugly and that a decoration was needed. A prize competition was then announced for the decoration of the tower. The competition was won by J. Zetterstedt, who was an official at the same company. The proposal was substantially reworked by the architect Fritz Eckert around 1890, and the tower got the 4 corner towers with pennant poles. At all major events in the city, it was decorated with flags. There were also smaller telephone towers at the company's substations on Svartmangatan 6 and Hornsgatan 9. As early as the beginning of the 1890s, the wires began to be joined together in underground cables. Around 1913, the rebuilding was completed, and the telephone tower lost its function, even though individual wires remained. Having the cables hanging in the sky above Stockholm was blocking the sun for the inhabitants. Did the sun ever shine in Mordor? In 1939, a rotating clock was mounted on the tower, the so-called NK clock. The dial has a diameter of 7.6 meters and was then Europe's largest. The NK clock was manufactured in 1939 by the company ASEA. ASEA, just like Ericsson, is also controlled by the Wallenberg family through their investment company, Investor AB. I'm sure you remember the swastika in the old ASEA logo type. The entire clock weighed 7 tons, and the NK clock became a popular feature in the cityscape. If you look at the telephone tower with its rotating clock at the top, what sort of parallels can you draw? Needless to say, Tolkien's metaphor for the all-seeing eye of Sauron was the NK clock, all-seeing as it symbolizes the surveillance that Ericsson conducts through the telecommunications infrastructure. Remember, the deep state controls both money and information, and Tolkien had a very good idea as to how. After Tolkien got into a dispute with his publisher, George Allen and Unwin, who didn't want to publish his novel, he had to turn to publisher William Collins in 1950. Tolkien intended the Silmarillion, itself largely unrevised at this point, to be published along with The Lord of the Rings, but Allen and Unwin were unwilling to do it. Milton Waldman, his contact at Collins, expressed the belief that The Lord of the Rings itself urgently needed cutting. After several back and forths with the publishers, Tolkien eventually got frustrated and demanded that they publish the book in 1952. Collins refused. On Wednesday, July 23, 1952, a fire broke out in Televerket's radio laboratory, which was housed underneath the telephone tower, causing severe damage to the tower and the rest of the building. The very next day, it was decided that the tower would have to be demolished. Tolkien again wrote to Allen and Unwin, saying, "I would gladly consider the publication of any part of the books," fearing his work would never see the light of day. One might think that somebody with influence didn't want the books published, or at least to delay the publication. In 1953, the telephone tower was finally demolished, officially citing the reason being that the risk of it collapsing was far too great. So the tower had stood for almost a year after the fire, but the risk of collapse was still too great for it to stay in place. The NK clock was dismantled shortly before the telephone tower was demolished, but reassembled within a year at its current location on the department store NK's roof. There had been plans to turn the telephone tower into a skyscraper, but because of the fire, it never happened. Delays in producing appendices, maps and indexes led to The Lord of the Rings being published much later than originally planned. The first book was published on the 29th of July, 1954, the second on the 11th of November, 1954, and the third on the 20th of October, 1955, in the United Kingdom. When the books got out to the public, the telephone tower was gone. There are many, many more metaphors in the books, but we've chosen this one because it is so central to the story. Another metaphor is that of a certain Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is the name of a character in Tolkien's Legendarium, and he is also featured in The Lord of the Rings, but was omitted both from Peter Jackson's film trilogy, the 1978 film, and the radio adaptations of The Lord of the Rings, as considered non-essential to the story, when he is, in fact, anything but. Due to Tom Bombadil's different nature, many of Tolkien's readers have speculated about him. Various attempts have been made to explain who he really is, and to make him fit into Tolkien's mythology. Tolkien, however, deliberately left Tom Bombadil a mystery. Tolkien was well versed in the Swedish language and culture, and probably even the mentality of the Swedish people, and he most definitely knew what entity that controlled both signal surveillance and the banking system. In The Lord of the Rings, when Frodo stays at Tom Bombadil's house, he asks a question to his wife. "Who is Tom, really?" She replies, "He is the master of wood, water and hill." That didn't really mean anything to Frodo, and what could that possibly mean? So maybe it's another metaphor. What is made using these three components? Wood, water and hills. At least since the 12th century, hydropower has been used in Sweden to take advantage of forests and ores. Around the year 1200, the first hydropower plants in the Nordic countries were built. For almost 700 years, hydropower has been used in the Nordic countries and has long been owned and controlled through the monarchy. The Crown had ownership of all major watercourses, along with the associated hydropower. By using more modern hydro plants, Sweden was later the first country in Europe to receive electricity. Härnösand was one of the first cities in Europe to have street lighting in 1885. Thanks to hydropower, Sweden also was the first country in the world to have electric trains. If any country should be considered the master of wood, water and hill, it's Sweden. Tom Bombadil is described as a happy person wearing a blue coat, yellow boots and a feather in his hat. As he is somewhat of a pacifist and seemingly benevolent, he took no open stance against the Dark Lord. He is also carefree and oblivious to the troubles of the world and is unaffected by the power of Sauron's ring. Remember, Sweden remained unaffected during both world wars and has in general probably the world's most mentally formatted population. And we do find it a bit strange that the connection between Tom Bombadil and Sweden hasn't been made earlier, seeing as the colours of his outfit should give the metaphor away almost instantly. It's almost as strange as the fact that these so-called Swedish interests has escaped any scrutiny and historical accounts to any decisive extent. Let's quote Tolkien himself. "Old Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow, bright blue his jacket is and his boots are yellow. None has ever caught him yet, for Tom he is the master, his songs are stronger songs and his feet are faster." Whatever could he have meant? It's our opinion that Tolkien was both pointing a finger at these Swedish interests lurking in the shadows, as well as being a satire of the Swedish people's mentality. The last example of a metaphor we will touch on is the fact that Frodo was taking the One Ring to Mordor, as it had to be destroyed in the same fire that it had been forged in. Seeing as the rings symbolized the central banks, it could be argued that the idea of central banking had to be destroyed at its place of origin. Do you remember where the world's first central bank was established? Sweden in 1668. Sadly, most metaphors in The Lord of the Rings fell on deaf ears, but by this time it's quite easy to see where the geopolitical events of today is going to lead. Eventually, history is being unravelled in reverse, and the core of the deep state is in Sweden. And maybe it's only a coincidence that the people counteracting the deep state uses a lot of Lord of the Rings references. If you look for it, you will find it. Thank you for listening.